Yesterday, we celebrated Independence Day, observing the day that the Continental Congress declared that the 13 American colonies were no longer subject and subordinate to the monarch of Britain, King George III, and that we were now a free, united, and independent states. It got me thinking about what it means to be independent. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, to be independent means not to be subject to control by others, to be self-governing. It can also be described as self-dependent, self-reliant, self-sufficient, self-supporting, or self-sustaining. Independence is a formal severing of ties with another entity, and I couldn't help but notice the repetition of the word self. It's freedom, but it's freedom alone, independent from one another. I, along with countless people around the world, gathered this weekend to watch the release of Hamilton, a story that chronicles the events of the American Revolution, independence, and the life of the title protagonist, Alexander Hamilton. During the show, Anthony Ramos, who plays Hamilton's close friend and comrade in arms during the American Revolutionary War, John Lawrence, tells hearers, "We will never be truly free until those in bondage have the same rights as you and me," and reminds them that there is much work left to be done when the revolution is over. And it is work that must be done collectively. Our gospel reading this morning echoes that same reminder. Jesus spoke to the crowd gathered together and said, "Come to me, all you that are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The picture that Jesus paints here is not one of independence per se, but instead interdependence, where we work together for the benefit of all, rather than for what just benefits us alone. After all, a rising tide lifts all ships. We've talked a great deal over the past month about the work of anti-racism and radical welcome of the LGBTQIA+ community. Just as Martin Luther teaches that the church is always reforming, the work of radical inclusion is never completely done. This work to make the church a welcoming place may sound uncomfortable or even exhausting, and you'd be right to think that. Radical welcome, or accompaniment, as it is sometimes called in church circles, is hard work. It's hard work because, as Linda Crockett describes it in her book, The Deepest Wound, accompaniment goes beyond solidarity, in that anyone who enters into it risks suffering and pain of those we would accompany. Accompaniment means forming relationships and sharing risks, joys, and lives with the communities that we accompany. But how is this work sustainable? That answer lies in our gospel reading today. When we yoke our own practices to Jesus, we receive a guide who brings humility, protection, wisdom, and order to the chaos. This act is so important that these verses are read by the bishop as a new pastor receives their stole the day that they are ordained. 6 months ago, I did not understand the significance of the words that Bishop Kevin Strickland spoke over me that day. Then I moved here a month before COVID-19 rocked New York City. It may shock you, but pastoring during a pandemic was not part of my theological education. It turns out none of my colleagues had experience with it either. Now, the call to be a pastor can be overwhelming and exhausting, even in the best of times. But if there's one thing that I've learned over the past few months, it is that this vocation is impossible to do independently from the greater community. And so rather than trying to figure things out on our own independently, we reached out to the greater community. We, as the people of Holy Trinity, yoked together, sharing the burden of envisioning what worship might look like when solely done outside the church building. We shared resources on best practices for how to keep safe, ideas for how to plan for safe re-entry whenever that time comes, and the list goes on and on and on. And that work doesn't stop with COVID or anti-racism or radical welcome. In preaching this sermon to you this morning, I am accompanied by 8 other pastors who yoked together to study and share ideas. We worked interdependently to engage ministry, even and perhaps especially when it is uncomfortable and exhausting. Jesus never says that this interdependent relationship will eliminate the burden or the exhaustion, but there is a freedom to be in community with God and with one another. When we yoke ourselves to Jesus, we have a guide for what that work looks like. When we yoke ourselves to the greater community, our burden becomes easier, even though it does not eliminate our own personal work or our responsibility to be an active participant in that work. Yoking together means that we have the ability to rest as individuals while others take the lead for a time, remembering that there is still work to do once our rest is done. That rest is a luxury that communities that we are called to accompany don't always have. And so it is our job to make spaces in which we exist places where safety and rest are possible. It is our responsibility to yoke together, to do work of liberation of the oppressed, but it is also our responsibility to rest so that the work is sustained. Combined, they allow us to be a force for change in the world.